Good morning, guys. Welcome to PowerPoints from the patio. So you're probably going to hear some noise in the background, dogs barking and wind chimes and whatnot. So I hope that doesn't interfere too much. But just watch the PowerPoint and pay attention to the questions that I'm going to give to you first so that you can go through and pay attention and then come back to those questions and answer those on the Moodle assignment that goes along with this PowerPoint. All right, here we go. So let's look at the questions. So there are three questions. Number one, who were the Buffalo Soldiers? Two, what was the impact of barbed wire and windmills on the cowboy way of life? And then number three, what groups of people were cowboys? So let's get into it. All right. So, factors leading to the expansion of Texas frontier. So, right after the Civil War, we have this huge expansion of the frontier. You've got a large amount of, I mean, Texas is Texas at that time. It's a huge amount of land and it's empty. Now, while the Civil War was going on, and that's where it kind of comes to play with this one right here, while the Civil War is going on, a lot of cattle ranches and things like that don't have anybody taking care of their herds of cattle, and their cattle get wild. They literally break out of pens, they go wander on the frontier. Cows are cows, they're going to take care of themselves. And so there's a large amount of wild cattle. So when you come back to Texas, all you need is a horse and some rope, a lasso, and you can go round up these cattle and you can have a free herd of cows, because the cows that are out there, they've been born wild. They're not branded. They belong to no one according to Texas law. So that was an opportunity for people to go get an income, because the demand for beef in northern uh, towns in northern states is huge. Immigration is still going on. You've still got large numbers of people coming from Europe into the United States, and they're going into the northern part of the United States. So these folks are looking for, you know, jobs. They're looking for, all the things they would need to survive. And part of that is food. And Texas, with its cattle herds, can provide that. So here we go. Let's talk about development of cattle industry from Spanish beginnings. So way back in early Texas history, when the Spanish explorers came through, we talked about them bringing through their horses and their cattle. And cows aren't dumb, despite what we say about them. If you let a cow loose, it's going to stay right near food and water. So the Spanish knew this about cows, so they would just let cows loose. They would literally leave them next to food and water, and they knew that when they came back through there, they would be able to find these cows, round them up, and harvest them, or to eat them, that sort of stuff. So the first cowboys are actually Spanish vaqueros. They are part of the mission system. So you have the Spanish teaching the Native Americans to be cattle ranchers. So cattle were part of Texas's history, going all the way back to the Spanish settlement, through Mexican national period, all the way into modern day Texas. So cattle trails were used to get them to railroads in this time period. So this part right here, which says cattle trails were used to get cattle to the railroads, which took them to market to northern states, that's a comment on cattle industry at the time of cotton, cattle, and railroads. So railroads weren't in Texas, so you needed to drive the cattle north to where the railroads went. So they had to use all these different cattle trails to get them there. All right, now we're going to talk about the myth and the reality of cowboys. Um, it talks about the numbers here of cowboys who were not white. This Hollywood history that we get is that all cowboys were white. They were, you know, a certain economic class. The reality is 1/3 of cowboys were African American. Um, there's a huge amount of Mexican Americans who are cowboys and even women. So the idea that there was this, white male cowboy, and that's predominantly what it was, that's Hollywood. That's not the actual cowboy that was on the open range. So you've got some famous cowboys down here, Daniel Webster, 80 John Wallace. So you've got all these different guys. An extension piece for you guys might be to look up some of these cowboys and find out why they were so important and what they did, and that sort of stuff. A lot of these guys started their own cattle herds, they started their own cattle ranches, and pushed cattle north on these great cattle trails that we're talking about here. All right, so now when we talk about cattle ranching, there are ways that geographic factors affected this economics development. If you look at limited water resources, you just look at this map. Right here, we're talking about this whole area, green, all lots of good water coming in on this side of the map. But if you go over into this yellow part of the map here, that's where there's almost no water. The rainfall is really, really not out there. So when people are looking for land to ranch on, to do cattle on, they're not successful over here in the yellow, until later on because of limited water resources. Especially, well, let me backtrack. They're not successful farming in West Texas. They just can't raise crops because there's not enough water naturally occurring. However, there is enough water to produce grasses, and grasses are what cattle eat. So they are able to produce these cows out there rather than crops. So West Texas does become known for cattle ranching. So does this part of South Texas. And that will only get better when we introduce the windmill. Now, let's take a look at the end of the cowboy way of life. So if you consider the cowboy way of life, these large, trail drives where thousands and thousands of cattle are being driven north to the railroads so that they can be taken to slaughterhouses in the northern cities, you have to think about that. If I'm going to get on a horse, I'm going to drive these thousands of cattle north, those cows are going to be walking. When they're walking, they're losing weight. I get paid for my cow to be fat and heavy, meaning more beef. So the idea there is that these cows are going to get skinnier as they walk. They're going to lose weight, and I'm going to lose money. I'm also going to lose cows along the way. If I encounter a group of non-friendly Native Americans, or I encounter some sort of bandits or something like that, where they're going to steal my cows. Cattle rustling was a problem. So the idea that this is hugely labor intensive and very difficult to do. So in order to keep up with demand and to meet the demand faster, things are going to be done to make it a more streamlined, more effective business. One of the things that we're going to get to is railroads. But the first thing we're going to talk about is the windmill. The windmill or wind pump or wind wheel basically provided water on land that had no water. So if you think about it, if I've got a ranch that has a river running through it, man, I got a great place to have my cows. I can let them wander down to the river, get, water. I can grow other crops because I can use the river to irrigate. However, if you've got the property next to me and you have no access to water because your land doesn't have natural water on it, well, you've got to come across my land to get to water, and I may not like that. So the idea there is that windmills will allow people to pump water from underground. So if you don't have surface water, then you don't need it because you can drill a water well use a windmill to pump it up into stock tanks and water your animals. That'll come into play when, barbed wire is a big thing, because that essentially closes the open range. Prior to the invention of barbed wire, there weren't fences everywhere, and cattle just were free grazing on any land they went on. So basically, I could graze my cattle on your land and water them on your land, and then take my cows to market and make lots of money. So I'm using your land to make money for me. And some people started to feel like, hey, I don't like that idea. I want my land to work for me. And so they started fencing stuff off. And if they've got things fenced off, that can create some animosity, because if you need to get your cows to water and I put a fence across the your property and my property, now we're going to have fights over this. However, those fights and all of that tend to end because now that we have the ability to access underground water and we have the ability to fence off land, so those two things working together start to end the need for cowboys to constantly be monitoring the herd of cows and making sure they're okay and all that. As soon as railroads get built in Texas, though, that's the end of the cattle drive. As soon as we have the ability to put them on a train, even before refrigeration cars, if we're loading them on the train alive, then in the day or two that it will take them to get to those northern cities, they're not going to lose the weight that they're going to, they would on a cattle drive. So the reality of what's happening here is the windmill allows us to farm and ranch on land that previously we couldn't. Barbed wire allows people to close off their land, and no longer do we have an open range where cows can just wander and I need a cowboy to bring them back. And then the cattle drives are ended because now I don't need to risk my cows getting stolen or lost or injured and losing weight on the way. I put them on a train and they get there overnight. So this modernization of Texas through these technologies really changes it, and it is the end of the cowboy way of life. Now, somebody we should talk about here is the Buffalo Soldiers, African-American soldiers. These were former slaves who fought during the Indian Wars. They are, a lot of them, former soldiers during the Civil War. You have to think about a young man, former slave, joins the Army in the Civil War, now has a job, has a lifestyle, all the respect in things that he may have wanted as a slave or aspired to as a slave, but now he's got them. And as part of the military, do you want to give them up? So no, this is an opportunity for African American former slaves to go out west and continue their military service. The idea there is that you have Native American groups who are being pushed further west and onto reservations, and they're fighting back. And the Buffalo Soldiers were a group of military personnel put on the frontier to fight the Native Americans. And down here it says Native Americans gave the nickname for their bravery. So supposedly that's where the nickname came from, the bravery of the buffalo and the bravery of the Buffalo Soldiers. So let's now take a look at the questions. All right, so that ends actually this lesson. So I'm going to go ahead and post this video. Remember to go back up to the top here for the cattle questions. Okay, so you've got those 3 questions to look at. The answers and the information are down here in the PowerPoint. So go through that and answer those questions and submit them. Thanks, guys.